Aloha from the East-West Center in Honolulu, and mahalo to viewers around the world for tuning into today's joint Gals with Lay Global and EWC Seminars Live webinar, Indigenous Voices, Indigenous Environmentalism. Gals with Lay Global leverages the Center's unique access to the world's policymakers, entrepreneurs, community leaders, and artists, virtually uniting these global forces with Hawaii's women leaders to harness their collective experience, ambition, and passion. Gals with Lay is intentionally dynamic and interactive. We will begin with our keynote speaker and panel, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Open space will follow Q&A with 20 minutes of unmoderated, interactive discussion amongst tables of 8. Open space is a unique opportunity to engage and network as peers with our esteemed speakers and your fellow attendees on any issue decided upon by your table. We encourage our audience to participate in and take advantage of the access open space provides. My name is Liz A. Dorn, and I'm a program coordinator here at the Center. It's my pleasure to introduce today's Indigenous women leaders and environmentalists representing Native American, Filipino, Indonesian, and Native Hawaiian communities in giving voice to the importance and value of adaptive practices and processes, sustainable management, and collaborative efforts across Indigenous communities globally in addressing environmental degradation and climate change. Ms. Dina Jalilo Whitaker is an author and lecturer at American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and is a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes. Awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by UN Environment in 2018, Ms. Joan Carling is an Indigenous Filipino human rights activist and environmentalist. She is currently the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development. Ms. Emanuela Shinta is a filmmaker and founding director of Ranu Wellum Foundation, which is globally renowned for its efforts in the Green Youth Movement, Borneo forest restoration, and Indigenous film festivals. Ms. Uolia Woodside is a kumuhula and executive director for the Nature Conservancy's Hawaii and Palmyra chapter, where she and her team protect and restore native watershed forests, as well as collaborate with communities to improve coral reefs and fisheries. Finally, our moderator, Ms. Stephanie Poston, is a visionary communications and public relations strategist for federal and state agencies, tribal governments, and Native organizations. She founded Poston and Associates on the Pueblo of Sandia, New Mexico, and is an alum of the Changing Faces Seminar. And now, I would like to take a moment to share our webinar protocols. Today's keynote and panel is on the record, recorded, and will be made available on YouTube for viewing and sharing. Each panelist will speak for up to 8 minutes. Viewers, your microphones and videos are turned off during the keynote. If you're experiencing difficulties with internet connectivity, AirMeet provides a low-definition option at the bottom right of your screen. AirMeet also provides the option to view closed captioning. To do so, simply select the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. For the best attendee experience, please connect to AirMeet using the most up-to-date version of a Chrome browser and disable any pop-up blockers to ensure your microphone and camera work properly. Q&A will take place after panelists' remarks. To submit a question, you may either virtually raise your hand using the hand icon or use the Ask a Question function at the right of your screen. In either case, please specify which panelist you wish to answer. Once Q&A concludes, viewers will be instructed to take a seat at any round table of your choosing for open space. Again, open space is intended to be an unmoderated, interactive discussion amongst peers. We encourage you to share the space and your voice. Also join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag GalsWithLay and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. Finally, I am delighted to introduce today's keynote, Ms. Heidi Totocini. Heidi is a senior advisor to the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs and a citizen of the Navajo Nation. She previously served as legislative counsel for Congresswoman Deb Haaland and Democratic Director of the Congressional Native American Caucus in the U.S. Congress. And with that, I'll hand over the program to our keynote for her remarks. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heidi Todicini. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation and Senior Advisor in the Office of the Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of the Interior. Thank you for inviting me to join the discussion today. Tribal nations have sovereign authority over their lands and waters. Tribes also have long-standing treaty and subsistence rights. The Biden administration respects and honors tribal sovereignty and understands that conservation of land and water must involve regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal nations. Our first Indigenous United States Cabinet Secretary, Secretary Holland of the Pueblo of Laguna in New Mexico, personally understands this and is committed to consulting with tribal nations on land and water management and the conservation of natural, cultural, and historical resources. Secretary Holland recognizes that subsistence involves the fundamentals of identity and culture, including the customs, traditions, values, and beliefs that make Native people, regardless of their location, distinctly unique. Through her direction, the Interior is taking a department-wide approach to address the climate crisis. For example, the Secretary recently established a climate task force to address the climate crisis and the resulting inequities. The Climate Task Force will continue to work across the department to accelerate renewable energy development and identify actions to foster investments in Indian communities for energy purposes. She also has renewed the department's commitment to increase transparency and incorporate science into environmental analysis and the decision-making process. This includes identifying the relationships between greenhouse gas emissions and the climate change and the resulting impacts on tribal communities. We will ensure that climate change and environmental justice are considered when making decisions that impact tribal nations and Native Hawaiian communities. Our leadership is committed to prioritizing tribal consultation in any action or priority decision that involves policy in the department engages on and is no different in moving forward on Indigenous environmentalism. I appreciate you having me here today, and thank you for your work on this critical issue, because it impacts all Indigenous communities globally. We are the original stewards of these lands, and it's up to us to help find sustainable solutions for the future of our global community. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that background, Heidi, and welcome from New Mexico back to your homelands. Welcome everybody to the East-West Center's Indigenous Voices, Indigenous Environmentalism. I'm your moderator, Steph Poston, coming to you from my own homeland of the Sandia Indian Reservation. I pay respect to my Tiwa ancestral homelands and my ancestors that are here always with us, leading and guiding us. I was honored when the East-West Center asked me to moderate this webinar. Centering Indigenous voices and issues is essential to doing the work required toward environmental justice. As Indigenous people, our ancestors were the strong protectors of Mother Earth, and that wisdom lives on through the work that this incredible panel does. And I am sure many in the audience do as well. There is so much work to be done to healing our beloved planet Earth. With that said, let's get into this conversation on Indigenous voices, Indigenous environmentalism, starting with our first panelist, Dina Gilio-Whitaker. If she will come on stage.
Can you see me? Am I on stage?
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. Let me share my screen. And let's go to presentation mode and okay. Okay, there we go. Why Pisnaxiok Isquis Dina Gilio Whitaker. And I, as has already been said, I'm a descendant member of the Colville Confederated Tribes from Washington State, but I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded homelands of the Hawaiian Nation in what's currently called Orange County in Southern California, in the town currently called San Clemente. So greetings, and I'm so happy to be here. I want to talk to you today just a little bit about the way I'm going to give you a very, very thumbnail sketch about the way that I talk about these things in my teaching. I teach at a university in San Diego County called Cal State San Marcos, and in an American Indian Studies department, and I teach courses on a wide range of topics related to American Indian Studies, including environmental issues, and a course called Traditional Ecological Knowledge, or TEK. And so what I'm going to give to you today is just a little snapshot of the things that I teach in that course. So when we talk about traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, what we're talking about is something that is it's applied knowledge of indigenous land management practices. It's the way that Native people have probably globally, we could probably say this globally, but in the context of the United States, or Turtle Island as we call it, TEK is about how Native people lived on the land in ways that they managed in very particular practices that maintained the health of the land and maintained food resources and basketry resources and things like that. So it's not just a theoretical concept or like warm, fuzzy words. It's actually applied knowledge. TEK recognizes the interdependence of all things. It begins with the worldview, a very particular orientation to the world, and we sometimes call it native science, to follow our esteemed elder at the University of New Mexico, actually, and one of my former mentors, Greg Cajete, from Santa Clara Pueblo, who really gave it that term, native science, because it does emphasize not just the interdependence of all things, but the fact that these are knowledge systems, native knowledge systems, based on long-term observation and practice of these management practices on the land. But it begins from a place of a particular worldview. So if we talk about worldviews and epistemologies, and to use that fancy academic word, and philosophical foundations, we talk about them, and we use this model in our department, our American Indian Studies department. We talk about the 4 R's. These are values. These are indigenous values that many, if not most, indigenous cultures worldwide recognize. And this is a very, very broad way of understanding these terms. And sometimes these terms in the English don't even have a direct translation into indigenous knowledges, but the values still convey. So we can talk about that. That first R is relationality. It's a value, this worldview that indigenous people see themselves as related to the earth and everything on the earth. These are kinship systems that go beyond the human realm. And these relationships are based on reciprocity. These are the recognition of the reciprocal nature of relationships when they are healthy and functioning. And when you have those kind of reciprocal relationships, excuse me, it implies respect. It implies a mutual respect. Part of that reciprocity is that Native people have that respect for each other as humans, but also for a sense of respect for the land itself, for the beingness of other life other than human. And a sense of responsibility comes out of that. So when you see yourself in relation or kinship with the natural world, in relations of reciprocity and respect, then automatically you are in a relationship that is responsible. So it's a responsibility-based paradigm as opposed to the Western worldview, which is based on rights. So the Western worldview, on the other hand, is a domination paradigm. We can take that all the way back to the doctrine of discovery that led to the modern world as we know it. Post 1492, the colonial world, because that's really where the modern state system comes during that time. It emerges at this time during these European voyages of discovery. This Western worldview based on domination is a hierarchical system. Because it's not relational, it doesn't see relationships in terms of reciprocity and respect, but it sees relationships in terms of hierarchies of humans and life in general. And humans, of course, are at the top of that hierarchy, and some forms of humans are lower than others, and then other life forms are below that. And finally, it's an extractive worldview because of its privileging of capital, of property, of rights, of the exploitation of the land. It's an extractive framework. So TEK, the model of TEK ultimately is sustainable. That's why indigenous, it's really the definition of indigeneity. So for indigenous cultures who are pre-colonial, typically thousands of years pre-colonial, they are indigenous because they learned how to survive within particular ecosystems, particular environments in ways that were fundamentally sustainable, because if they didn't, they wouldn't survive. So these are place-based knowledges that lead to sustainability. Whereas the Western society, the dominant cultures that we're talking about, they're really death cultures. If you think in terms of how long, for example, in the United States, we have 500 years of colonialism of Europeans arriving here and imposing their societies on top of indigenous societies. Within those 500 years, which is the blink of an eye in the context of time, or geologic, even human time, these arrivants, people who come from other places, have only been here for a relatively few minutes, and with their technology narrated by progress and modernity, have brought us to the brink of like this existential crisis that we're all dealing with around climate change and environmental degradation. So these are fundamental differences in orientation to the world. And this, in my opinion, the climate change crisis is not as much a crisis of technology or economics. It's a crisis of philosophy and worldview. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just end. And thanks for listening. I hope I didn't go over too much.
You're perfect. Thank you so much for that presentation. I love the 4 R's. It reminds me a lot of teachings that I've been exposed to. Our next speaker is Joan Carling. Joan, if you will. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm also happy to be part of this conversation. I want to start with showing where I come from. This is the share screen. Okay, sorry. Okay, I think there's a problem in my sharing screen, but never mind. Hello, can you still see me?
We can hear you and see you. Yes.
All right, yeah, because I don't see it in screen now. Let me first say that I'm an indigenous person coming from the mountains of the Cordillera region from the Philippines. And I very much echo what has been said earlier by Dina in terms of the values that we have in relation to the management of forests, and basically who we are as indigenous peoples. But being a mountain person in the context of adapting to the environment that we are, we in the Cordillera have developed, for example, the rice terraces and mountain slopes that has been providing our needs for generations. And that is because of the very strong cooperation and solidarity values of indigenous peoples in working together to adapt to the environment that we have. So through the efforts and innovations of indigenous peoples in the past decades and even centuries, these rice terraces has been providing not only our food but also the way we interact with other resources. For example, in relation to forest, customary rules has been developed in terms of when to hunt, what kind of animals can be hunted or not. Also, what plants can be used for food, what can be used for medicines. And the principle of sharing is very much integral to our culture, that when we produce something like different food items in our rice terraces, we share it with others. And the one that we cannot use, we preserve it for the future use. So these are the attached values that we have. So just to re-echo again what has been said earlier, that we look at these elements or nature as a common good that we share and conserve, and that the relations of reciprocity is very much part of what we call the intergenerational base of support for our survival and well-being as indigenous peoples. And part of this is also the principle of do no harm, that because we are interdependent, we should not also then do harm to the environment and to the other people or the members of our communities. And this value of doing no harm is also in line with our values of living in harmony with nature, that we don't try to control or for individual benefit, but more on it as a common good that we all need to take care for us now and the future generation. So now, with the changes that has been happening, I just want to stress the reason why a lot of indigenous communities remain their resilience and are being able to adapt is because of the very strong sense of solidarity and cooperation and selflessness among indigenous peoples. We know that we cannot just survive on our own, but we can collectively survive if we help each other, especially also in times of disasters or calamities. So these values are also expressed in the sharing of labor, for example, working together on the rice fields of each. So we work on the rice field of one family, and then as a group, and then we move to the next. And then we also do that during harvest. So this collective effort is really the one that is also building our resilience and adaptive capacities as indigenous peoples. So in these principles and values that are embedded among indigenous peoples in where I come from, we're able to make some parts of the nature as productive to meet our needs, not only in terms of food but also in terms of medicines, and that is also providing us these years of interaction, then the knowledge that we build on as we continue to adapt. So and that knowledge is inherently transferred to the next generation through different forms of practices between the interlearning between elders and the young generations. So now, with this kind of practices that we have, we can then continue even to address the impacts of climate change that we are facing today. So I want to end with that, and in the next round also share what are the challenges and opportunities of collective voice and collaboration efforts of Indigenous peoples around the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joan, for sharing that insight with us. It's beautiful. It sounds beautiful. It sounds so beautiful. Our next speaker is Emanuela Shinta. If you can please come forward.
Thank you. Adil Katalino Bacuramin Kasaruga Basengat Kajubata Arus. Greetings from Kalimantan. My name is Emanuela Shinta. I'm from a Dayak from Borneo Island. And before I started my presentations, I would like to tell you a story. So there is this indigenous woman from Dayak Manyan tribe from the heart of the Borneo. Her name is Ibu Mardiana, and she is a retired nurse. And not only nurse, she has been fighting for the indigenous rights, fighting for her land for more than 30 years, for over 3 decades. And once I had these conversations with Ibu Mardiana, I asked her, how many organizations, how many projects, how many green movements that has come to you and work in this area with you? And she answered, there were so many. In the past 30 years, I cannot count anymore, because there are so many projects, so many organizations coming, and she always assists them to do their works on the ground. And then I asked this question again to her, and then, is there any winning on your side? Is there any meaning for the communities here? And she was silent and then answered softly, not at all. There is no winning yet. So that's just one example of how actually we should really think about what we are doing, whether we work on the green projects or restoration effort, or let's say like defending the rights of indigenous community. We are coming to the village and working with the communities, trying what we say We want to empower them and support them and become their allies. So if in 30 years there is no winning in that area for that community, even though there are so many organizations and green movements do the work on that area, so there must be something wrong in mechanism. Before I continue with that, I would like to tell you about my homeland, Borneo. Borneo is the third largest rainforest in the world, and like some funny facts about, not funny actually, well, some amazing facts about Borneo wildlife. I will just quickly tell you. Like in Borneo here, I just got this, from some websites talking about Borneo wildlife. So it's a home to around 222 mammals and 44 endemics, and at least 15,000 plants, in which 6,000 are endemic. It can be found in the swamps, mangroves, and lowland and mountain forests of the land in the Borneo. And then these trees, what we call in our local language growing trees, hold the greatest insect diversity on Borneo. As many as 1,000 species can be found only in one tree. So that's some facts of the Borneo wildlife for you to imagine how actually the land where I live right now is a very rich island full of natural resources, and of course the biodiversity as well. And I haven't mentioned about our tropical peatland forests that become the center of international research for so many years. So that's the place where I lived. And the funny thing was, whenever there is this international coverage about the Borneo wildlife and then its rainforest and so on, there is only a little mentions about the first people of the land, Dayak people. I am a Dayak. I am an indigenous, and we are the first people of the land. So the Dayak consists of more than 400 subtribes, beautiful culture, beautiful people, as you saw in the videos. And actually, before 18th centuries, we were nomadic, so we kind of very close with the nature. We live with the natures. So for the Dayak forest is more than a resources or community. It's a part of our identity. That's the connections with our ancestors. And actually, in the past, in the Dayak community, actually, like every village has to have this sacred forest, what we call Pukung Pahewan. So it is characterized by big trees and then rivers and also sacred small house inherited from Dayak ancestors named Pasah Petahu. So in the past, every village protect like one sacred forest, and that's the place that cannot be touched by man, because if you do something without any permissions or like any rituals asking for the permission from your ancestors and also the natures, and then something bad will happen to you, right? So I would say for the Dayaks, like forest is very, very important, and I believe that's also important for many indigenous communities in the world. But somehow, like I mentioned, because of these misconceptions and because of the trace of colonialisms that are being left on the indigenous community, so there is this paradigm that the indigenous community, especially in the Borneo, for the Dayak people, are the ones that starting the fire, or like are the ones that not protecting the land, but like they say, hey, we hunt, like we're doing hunting, and then hey, we make this some of the animals extinct. That's what Western conservationists say about us. So I would like to show you one more pictures, so you can see where I live here. Right. So this is the Kalimantan landscape. It's very beautiful, right? This is the place where I live. But
How did you do that?
this is what's happening right now in my homeland. Okay. So this is not something that we like to see, right? It's very, very sad things to see. And this is where I live, actually. And something that media never covers was these forest fires already happened for 24 years. So the Dayak already live here for hundreds years, for 1,000 years, and there is no such kind of things before. But now, in the past like 50 years, more than 50% of the rainforest in Kalimantan is gone. So what's happening there? Well, the thing was, people will blame the Dayak community as the one who started the fire, while actually, in opposite, we are the one who protect the forest and protect the land. So, well, actually, that's a sad thing, but you know, like the Dayak may be vulnerable, but we are not hopeless and helpless. So that's why I'm here speaking to you about our voices. And, you know, like in our places right now, in my communities, like we mobilize young people to do something about that. Actually, for these forest fires, the cause is the land wrong management that happened in 1997. So at the time, our government in Indonesia, which is still like very Java-centrist, they try to do this rice farming in Kalimantan, but use the method and land management from Java. While actually the texture of the soil is different, right? So that's the beginning of the problem. So me and my team here, we try to change the narrative. We started to collect the stories. We started to capture the wisdom from the elders about the land management. We show to the world, hey, this is how it should be done, actually. Because if you only do it based on research and what you think is a high-tech things, you know, like, and then another chapter of environmental disaster will happen. Because this is not funny. People are dying because of the poisonous air. And not only that, we lose our home. It's never okay to see your own home burning, right? So, actually, right now, what we face in Indonesia, we have this food estate project conducted by government, and that's because of the pandemic, you know, like because of this COVID situation, and they say, hey, we should like build this food estate so the country can survive. But yeah, you know, like the thing was the management of the land never involved the indigenous communities. So that is a big problem. So what I want to say is we are still doing something about it. We run a campaign. We collect like about 36,000 signatures with young people. We try to raise awareness about this, and of course also to provide the alternative solution from the ground. So if there's something I can say, first, the Dayaks are not the ones who caused the fires. And the second, indigenous communities should be at the center of restoration effort or advocacy works, because they are not the object of your green project. They are the subject in their own stories. And then the third is investing in youth could be a very good solution for us to protect our future. And for the audience here, thank you so much for listening to me. And if you're an indigenous, let's build a connection and solidarity. And if you are non-indigenous, let's build a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. Tabe Salamate ka Kalimantan.
Thank you, Manuela. That's beautiful, and your work on that narrative shift is so much needed. Our next speaker, Eulalia Woodside.
Elena, aloha mai kako. Can you hear me and see me okay?
I can, yes.
Excellent. Ku ka puno hula I ka moana, hele I ka ehu ka uhi ka aina. O lapa ka uila noho I ka hiki e ala. Uina na kolo ua ka pihe. Uina na kolo ua ka pihe. Lau ka naka ka hula e la ka e. Delina mai ka hikina kala puka I hae hae a hiki lo aku I kaula na kala I ka pai o pui ke kai e mai ana mani hoa makamole mai o le hua ano ai mai ka kou e iau o ulalia ke noho nei I ka olu o ke kahaone o Waimanalo makamoku o ko olau poko makamoku puni o Oahu makapai aina o Hawaii nei ka aina kulaiwi o nā kanaka maoli o nā Hawaii aloha mai kākou. As we gather today in the spirit of connecting, learning, and advancing the work we do, let's take a moment to reflect on the land where our feet touch the ground, wherever that may be. I am sitting in Waimanalo in the district of Ko'olaupoko on the island of Oahu within the archipelago of Hawaii. No conversation about Indigenous voices and Indigenous environmentalism in the context of Hawaii is complete without acknowledging that the mountains, forests, streams, ocean, and coastlines of Hawaii that we seek to conserve and learn from are the ancestral and current homeland of the Kanaka Maoli, Na Hawaii, the native Hawaiian people. We Kanaka Maoli have lived in close relation to this land for hundreds of years, yet today we retain legal control to significantly less than 1% of our original homeland. Too often when it comes to the decisions that affect our lands, waters, and livelihoods, Indigenous peoples have been denied the opportunity to participate in meaningful ways. We've heard that today from our other guests and speakers. Supporting the strengthened voice, choices, and actions of Indigenous people in sustainable management and the use of natural resources is critical for a future of healthy lands, waters, and communities. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across barriers of heritage and difference. Today, I recognize and pay respect to my people, Na Hawaii, Na Kanaka Maoli, past, present, and emerging, who are stewards of these lands and waters in Hawaii. To the question about the importance and value of Native Hawaiian traditions and adaptive practices in sustainable management and the use of natural resources, that's what I used to frame my opening today. There are three important components to my opening. First, language, which is the repository of words and cognition of the tangible and intangible, the way Kanaka see, understand, and categorize our world is captured in Olelo Hawaii, our language. And there are words for degrees of space like ocean or air, or words for relationships or behavior like kuleana that don't exist in English or in quite the same way in other languages because it's connected to this place. The second component is the oli, the chant, our oral tradition that contains the collective vision of our hopes, the science and generational wisdom, as well as the management practices or appropriate behaviors to provide for sustainability and resilience. And the third component to my opening was that land and water and people acknowledgement, in which I speak to the ethics of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and specifically the injustices of land taking and separation of Native people from traditional places. Hawaii represents some of the greatest biodiversity and ethnic diversity in the world, whether born here, moved here, or have ancestors dating back generations here. Hawaii is more than where we live. Hawaii shapes us. Those of us who understand this, that our identity, values, respect, and well-being are shaped and baked into us by this special place, know it's our kuleana, both our privilege and our responsibility to live by the traditional Hawaiian expectation of reciprocity. We know that residents and visitors alike cannot simply take or do what they want. All of us have to give to these lands. We have to preserve them. And that leads to a challenge Native Hawaiians and Indigenous people around the world face, specifically as it concerns to environmental degradation and climate change. Do we have agency or authority of governance in our homelands to influence and bring forward that voice, that choice, and that action which reflects healthy lands, waters, and communities? We have some examples that show the impact of our voice, choice, and actions in different places. In my various roles over the past 2 decades, I've been fortunate to be associated in one example with the community of Ka'upulehu on the island of Hawaii. I'm a descendant of previous generations of conservationists intent on preserving the unique native biodiversity of that aupua'a, or from the shoreline to the mountain. I have been the representative of a landowner. I've served as the state board decision maker. I support colleagues today to provide technical expertise to that community. Ka'upulehu is a place where generational knowledge records show the cycles of fish diversity and abundance, and where ancestral wisdom dictates the proper management and use practices to maintain that diversity and abundance. In recent times, land tenure and infrastructure changes, along with increases in human uses, have resulted in decreases in fish diversity, numbers, and size in significant and measurable ways to concern the Native community. the Native Hawaiian families and that have generational habitation and land and ocean use traditions in Ka'upulahu actively lobbied through the legal system, through its active participation on voluntary committees and community-led organizations, and through government administrative rulemaking processes to establish a coastal management system grounded in and reflecting the traditional kapu system or traditional kapu traditions in which Hawaiian land use and people management systems are brought forward. The state adopted the community's recommendation to establish a fishery reserve, which reflects that Native Hawaiian tradition and adaptive management practice of kapu that prescribes resource rest areas and resource rest times. And the community chose to pause and wait to fish along a portion of the shoreline for 10 years. It's a big sacrifice for a community. In the time from when that kapu or rest period was put in place in 2016 to today, total fish biomass, number and size of fish has increased by 173% inside versus 73% outside of that kapu area, that designated fishery reserve. And the biomass of the fish that's most prized for our community eating and most prized by fishers has increased by 250% increase inside versus 91% outside that kapu area or that traditional rest area. Native Hawaiian adaptive management practices provide us a roadmap to create abundance and resilience on our islands. And they need, and this is what we need to withstand the threats that we face, and especially those threats of climate change. I look forward to sharing more with our panelists in question and answer. Mahalo.
Thank you. We can get some love in the chat for all our panelists and their powerful words that they shared. What was most beautiful and touching to me is I think we heard like 5 indigenous languages, and those languages are so sacred and an essential key part of the work that we're doing to help protect our Mother Earth. So thank each and every one of you for what you're doing. I'd like to start seeing if we have some questions, but I first like to start with a question to one of our panelists, and the narrative shift that Emanuela is doing. What is one thing that you might be asked the audience or the panelists to take action on that might help to make that movement, help with that narrative shift? And so I pose that question to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Like I always say like this, for so many years, it's been a long time, like our voices like being silent, and like we do not have a place or platform where we can share our own stories, but only being framed by someone else from outside Kalimantan. So in these situations, in this time when we started to speak our voices, I would like to say you can become our echo, spread our message. Tell people about what's happening here, even including this palm oil situations, like what palm oil companies do on the ground with the situation here right now, people suffering and so on, because this never been covered in the mainstream media. So when we have this alternative media, we share this like in form of films or talk like this. Please become our echo, share, spread. And if you feel like you are connected to us, just feel free to reach out to us, and then we will find like more ways to work together. I think that's the most important thing right now.
Thank you so much. So I'm looking for raised hands or any questions in the chat. Anybody want to come forward with a question? So the other question I will ask is a question for Dina. I know we got to hear a little bit from Ms. Todachini, but how important do you think representation is to making these changes? Here in the States, we saw 2 Native Congresswomen elected for the first time ever, and now with having the Secretary of Interior, the first Native woman, like how does that representation play into how solutions can come forward?
So I think that it's really, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, great. I think it's really important. Certainly we've never had an American Indian person, at least not in the last 100 years, if ever, in a position that's significant or with that much authority. So, and the fact that she is so well educated, she's so grounded in her culture, she's grounded in, she knows the law. Her ethics are in the right place. She understands the environmental issues, and it's really reflected in the way that she speaks and the kinds of projects that she's uplifting. She's taking a really broad approach as well into the kinds of things that she's dealing with. So she understands the holistic nature of Indigenous circumstances and that's reflected in her commitments to everything from protecting sacred sites to protecting women and everything in between. So I think the representation is important, especially for someone like her. She seems to have been effective as a congressman. As a congressperson, I think she's in a better position now. I don't think just because we have somebody that's Indigenous in the Congress that they're effective, because look, we have Tom Cole and we have Mark Wayne Mullen, who are Republican men who, are from an area where they have not done anything for Native people at all of substance. So just by virtue of being Native and being in a public office doesn't necessarily translate into effective or meaningful legislation for Native people. Sharice Davids, don't know about her either. So, but I think Deb Haaland is the perfect person to be in that position right now. And there's a lot of hope and promise for what will happen with her.
Thank you for that. So this next question is for Joan. What role should international organizations play in protecting Indigenous rights and lands?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the very framework that we're operating at the global level is the respect, recognition, and protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples. So the international community should urge states particularly to abide by their obligations to respect and protect human rights, because that's a major obstacle now in the way we are sustainably managing our resources. Now, we have the right to our lands, territories, and resources, but that is not legally recognized in many countries. In fact, majority of indigenous countries with indigenous peoples do not even provide legal recognition to indigenous peoples as a distinct group and to our collective rights, and that is the scenario in Asia and Africa, where more than 80% of the indigenous peoples around the world is part of. So if we're talking of support needed by indigenous peoples, it's really on how to urge governments as well as business respect our rights and to stand by us, especially when we fight back, when our lands and resources are being grabbed or destroyed. We need international solidarity and we need international action and cooperation to prevent those kinds of destruction and of our lands and resources, because as expressed earlier, this is not just about the commercial value of these resources, but it's the intergenerational values of these resources that we are protecting. So yeah, that's and the global support by different actors is urgently needed now, as our resources are getting depleted through forced land grabbing and destruction. And now we are facing also the challenges brought by climate change.
Thank you. Thank you. So this next question is for Eulalia. What are some of the challenges you have faced in connecting to and collaborating with Indigenous communities, both nationally and globally?
Thank you for that question. And, you know, I think one of the challenges that we face is sort of comes through in the stories that we hear here today. And that is that we are all in our communities and in our homes and in our places, there is much to do. And there are a number of challenges that we are working on any given time. And finding the bandwidth and the state and the space in which to make those connections and move forward on systemic actions. And so what I mean by that is there's a lot going on, and there are a number of different ways in which we need to make progress and move forward, whether that's at the local scale, whether that's, so in using America framework in Hawaii at this sort of county type of scale or jurisdiction, at a state level scale or jurisdiction, or a national scale or jurisdiction, or that global scale or jurisdiction. Some of the challenges are just having that bandwidth and the resources to be able to continue to make progress in those areas. All of this takes time, it takes organizing, it takes those resources. I don't think in our communities I have ever seen a challenge that was in the lack of ingenuity, or the lack of innovation, or the lack of drive, or the lack of perseverance. All of those things exist in our communities locally, nationally, and globally, and we strive to make those connections together in order to move them forward. Part of the challenge is there is so much work to do together. I think what I would like to also, just briefly touch on is the networks and the partnerships that are then the other side of those challenges, which are those opportunities that we have to work together, and the ways in which actually we see some success in working together and sharing our stories together, and then galvanizing around specific actions that we can move forward.
Great. Well, I have you here, there's another question for you. What are some adaptive practices that people can do in Hawaii right now?
Some of the adaptive practices that that we can do in Hawaii right now, and I'm gonna just take a step back, and I don't know who we is, individually, organization, government. So I'm going to very briefly talk about a couple of those. As an individual, one of the key adaptive practices that we see moving through our communities, especially at the grassroots level, is a recognition of our need to get outside, to be observant, and to continue the traditions of our ancestors. In Hawaii, it's called kilo, or observation, and to record and to document in those chats like I did, to make sure that we continue to add to that record, and so that we can continue to make sure that our communities and our children are observant and see the changes and continue to practice that traditional ecological knowledge or that indigenous science that we talked about. The other thing that we need to do, moving a scale up from ourselves, is within our communities. In every one of our communities in Hawaii, there are community organizations that are specifically dedicated to understanding their places, whatever that might be, where their food comes from, where their water or where their coastal resources come from, and they are doing their work to try and protect those spaces. And so as community members, we need to be active, and we need to get into those spaces. And then moving one scale up is we need to take that action, and then we need to move it into addressing and allowing for good policy and good guidance to happen. In all of our communities, there are different movements towards elevating authority and autonomy and governance, and we should work towards those. And we need to also make sure that in the meantime, threats and changes are happening quickly. And so can we influence policy? Can we influence action now that can make sure that this connection that we have between this place and the resources and the species continues to be strong, and there continues to be health there. So that which we learn as ourselves in our community, we can move it into that policy space and make sure that the policy space knows we got to be able to adapt based on that knowledge and that observation that we've been making over those generations.
Thank you for that. This next question we have is for Dina. It was mentioned that the real problem is a crisis of philosophy and world views. How do we go about integrating and reconciling? And the other part of it, and or navigating this as students, teachers, activists, etc.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. How do we convince, the paradigm that we all live in, of course, is predominantly the Western paradigm, which is based on capitalism and extraction from the land. And so, but it's kind of like the fishbowl problem. Like you can't, it's the fish that lives in the fishbowl that can't see the water that it swims in. It's the air that we breathe. And so this is a matter, in my opinion, it's like the beginning point is education. You have to really be able to name this, to talk about it, and to name it and talk about it in the places that matter, including and maybe even most importantly to the science community, the people, the science community, the conservationists, people who are on the land, who are doing tackling climate change and all these other environmental problems, and frame it for them. So because once they see it and you can't unsee it. And then you can start, then it can inform the kinds of research questions that they're asking, because that's how we do things, right? That's how the science does things. Well, how all academic pursuits start is with research questions, but it's worldviews that inform the kinds of questions that are asked. And so this is how I teach it. I speak to science groups frequently, and and bring this up, and I'm really finding some surprisingly openness. There's more and more openness in the last couple of years. It's people are starting to think this. They know that the way that we're doing things is not helping us. It's hurting us. It's Western technology and science that brought us here to this existential crisis that we're all in. So we have to be able to say it and not default to thinking we can handle this with the techno fixes or the economic fixes. So it's it begins with education, like everything.
Right. So I saw one of the questions in the chat, and you can't get through one of these webinars and talk about climate and changes without talking about COVID and how Indigenous communities have handled COVID. Here in my state, the pueblos, the tribes were hit very hard. As for the vaccines and how has that been going? I feel like the tribes here in my state have done an excellent job of getting our communities vaccinated. And I think, there's a lot of things we don't like about Indian Health Service, but I think that system worked in this particular scenario. It wasn't seamless or perfect, but it certainly helped. And, none of us, including myself, my oldest son got COVID, escaped from COVID, families, relatives, friends. But I'd like to ask, like Joan, in your country, how are the Indigenous populations and the vaccination rates going there?
Yeah, we're actually on a very terrible shape. Only, I think, 2% of the whole population is vaccinated, and these are more the people in the urban areas where the vaccine is more accessible. But even also globally, we're losing, we are on an alarming level, Indigenous peoples around the world, because a lot of our elders who are traditional knowledge holders and language holders are dying. And that has a profound implication to us, to our cultural heritage, to our cultural practices, to our practice of self-determination. So that's why there's a strong appeal of indigenous peoples around the world for access and delivery of vaccine to indigenous territories. We've seen thousands of indigenous peoples in India dying all over the place simply because they don't have any support coming. And since indigenous peoples, majority, more than 70% of indigenous peoples around the world are living in remote areas. And in many remote areas, particularly in developing countries in Asia and Africa, do not even have access to basic health. And even in relation to in Africa, for example, where it's a requirement to use masks and to use soap to wash hands, they cannot even buy mask or buy soap to clean their hands. So we're really in a bad shape. And so there's a global appeal of indigenous peoples around the world for states and companies to make sure that vaccine reach indigenous territories.
Great. It's unfortunate, and I'm so sorry that you all are having those challenges with regard to access. It's always amazing, those sort of challenges that are put before us. Just a quick time check. Liz, are we still doing okay on time, or do we need to close out the Q&A?
I think we have time maybe for one question.
And I think everybody's had a chance. Manuela, I mean, everybody, you're getting some love in the chat here about that whole narrative shift. Is there any parting words that you might offer about how we, what support is needed? The work you're doing with the youth just sounds incredible.
Yeah, maybe just because I saw also the questions in the chat here, I feel like the situation is really desperate, for as like Joan also mentioned, so especially in the situations of COVID, right? And even in Kalimantan, we have been exposed to smoke, breathing in such poisonous air for 24 years. So can you imagine the lungs of people in Kalimantan are very vulnerable to the COVID. So what we have right now, it's very difficult. Even I just got my vaccine yesterday because it's really hard to get vaccine here. But yeah, I always think like this, my generation has to do something. This is also addressed to the questions about the lost generations. If one generation's lost its role, and then there will be a gap, and this will lead to another bigger problem for the indigenous communities. So I feel like our generations plays very important role to connect what we receive from the ancestors to the younger generations. And in this situation of COVID also, we try to do what we can do. We provide this translation for indigenous communities, because the Dayak speaks more than 400 different languages. So we try to translate the information about COVID situation to the Dayak language, to the original language, and spread it. So in this case, I will say we can use our knowledge, our skills, even our competence in technology to do something for our community, because it's possible. And of course, also other panelists also mentions, is really about partnerships. The question here also, I saw how can we help your work most effectively? What I will say is there are so many indigenous communities and indigenous initiatives on the ground, on the front line of the battle, environmental battle. So this is the time for us to convert our ideas, our concepts into an action, because that's what we need immediately right now. So reach out to us, reach out to the indigenous initiatives, communities, or organizations. See how you can support their works, bottom-up approach. And then you will find there is a lot of things that can be done, even in the midst of oppression, desperation, and limitation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, can I respond also to this question on lost generation?
Joan, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I want to move us into open space so that everyone has an opportunity to chat with y'all in a more intimate environment, if that's all right. But I want to thank everyone so much for submitting so many excellent questions and to our panelists for your thoughtful responses. Please remain where you are and take a seat at any available roundtable to share your voice. We are moving on into open space, which begins now. Remember, this is an opportunity to ask all of the questions that were unasked in a more intimate setting. And remember, whoever comes are the right people, and whatever happens was supposed to happen.